In the humid, tense years of the late 1930s, the world's leading air ministries realized something terrifying. The romantic era of the wooden biplane, the open cockpit, fabric-covered machines of the Great War, wasn't just dying, it was a death trap. The next war would be won by the nation that could master the total metal monoplane. This wasn't just an upgrade, it was a complete reinvention of physics. Engineers across the globe were suddenly obsessed with a single metric: velocity. Speed was no longer for racing trophies or bragging rights, it was a matter of national survival. If your bombers were slower than their interceptors, your cities would burn. If your fighters were slower than their bombers, you were defenseless. In the rolling hills of southern England, a soft-spoken genius named R.J. Mitchell was sketching what would become the supermarine Spitfire. Mitchell didn't just want a fast plane, he wanted a slipper, an aircraft that could slide through the air with almost zero resistance. He gave it the iconic elliptical wing, a shape that was incredibly difficult and expensive to manufacture, but offered a near-perfect lift-to-drag ratio. Under the hood sat the Rolls-Royce Merlin, a V12 engine that breathed through a supercharger, allowing it to maintain its scream even as the air grew thin. When the Spitfire Mark I first took to the skies, it wasn't just a machine, it was a masterpiece of aero art. Clocking in at 362 miles per hour, it was faster than anything the British public had ever imagined. Pilots described flying it not as operating a machine, but as wearing a suit of wings. But across the English Channel, the Germans weren't just watching, they were building a predator. Willy Messerschmitt's philosophy was the polar opposite of Mitchell's grace. His Bf 109 was a masterpiece of brutal, cold efficiency. It was small, almost too small for its pilot, and built around the concept of power to weight. Messerschmitt wrapped the smallest possible airframe around the largest possible engine, the Daimler-Benz 601. Unlike the British Merlin, the German engine used direct fuel injection. This meant that while a Spitfire's engine might sputter and cut out during a sharp nosedive due to fuel float issues, the Bf 109 could simply point its nose at the earth and scream downward with a constant flow of power. In the early days of the Blitzkrieg, the 109 was a shock to the system, hitting speeds of 350 to 370 miles per hour and establishing a vertical wall over Europe that few Allied pilots could climb over. While Europe was locked in a localized dogfight, American engineers were looking at the map and seeing a different problem: distance. If the U.S. was to fight, it needed speed that could be sustained over thousands of miles. Entered the P-38 Lightning. Designed by the legendary Kelly Johnson at Lockheed, the P-38 looked like something out of a pulp science fiction novel. With its twin-boom tail and two massive Allison engines, it was the first fighter to truly push the compressibility barrier. The P-38 was a monster of a machine, a high-altitude interceptor that could reach 400 miles per hour when the Spitfires and 109s were still struggling to break 370. It was the fork-tailed devil, a plane so fast and powerful that it required entirely new flight manuals just to teach pilots how to handle the physics of such extreme velocity. This early war race was a desperate game of leapfrog. Every time a British engineer tweaked a carburetor to gain 5 miles per hour, a German engineer would shave 10 pounds of weight off a landing gear to match it. These aircraft represented the absolute peak of piston engine technology, pushing the limits of what a propeller could physically do.
They were vibrating, roaring testaments to human ingenuity, forged in a time when the king of speed wasn't just a title, it was the difference between a pilot coming home or becoming a statistic in the clouds. The skies had begun, and as the 1940s dawned, the world was about to find out exactly how fast a man could fly before the air itself began to fight back.
By 1943, the race for speed hit a literal wall, not of enemy planes, but of physics. The world's top pilots were reporting a terrifying new phenomenon. As they pushed their aircraft into high-speed dives, the controls would suddenly freeze. The plane would begin to shake as if an invisible giant were trying to tear the wings off. This was compressibility. They were approaching the speed of sound, and the air, which usually flowed smoothly over the wings, was becoming as hard as concrete. The king of speed was no longer just fighting the enemy, he was fighting the very nature of the atmosphere. In America, the solution was brute force. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, affectionately known as the Jug, was built around the most powerful radial engine ever put into a fighter, the Pratt & Whitney R2800. To solve the speed problem at high altitudes, engineers didn't just give it a bigger engine, they built the entire plane around a massive turbo supercharger system hidden in the belly. This allowed the P-47 to breathe thin air as if it were at sea level. At 30,000 feet, where German fighters began to gasp for oxygen, the Thunderbolt was a 7-ton freight train hitting 430 miles per hour. It was the ultimate expression of what a piston engine could do, but it was also the limit. Propeller tips were now spinning so fast they were breaking the speed of sound themselves, creating shock waves that killed efficiency. The propeller era was redlining. While the Americans used size, the British turned to a quiet, obsessive engineer named Frank Whittle. For years, Whittle had been mocked for his crazy idea of an engine with no propeller, a gas turbine. But as the war reached its peak fever, the British government finally listened. The result was the Gloucester Meteor. It was a ghost-like machine that flew without the rhythmic thumping of a piston engine, replaced by a haunting, high-pitched whistle. Entering service in 1944, the Meteor was the Allies' first true jet. It was fast, hitting 415 miles per hour with ease, but the British were so terrified of the technology falling into German hands that they forbid it from flying over enemy territory. The Meteor spent its days chasing down V-1 buzz bombs, proving that only a jet could catch a robot. But in the secret underground factories of Germany, a more radical king was being forged. The Luftwaffe was losing the war, and they knew that incremental speed wouldn't save them. They needed a leap. They turned to the Focke-Wulf Ta-152, the ultimate long-nosed piston fighter. Designed by Kurt Tank, this aircraft was a desperate masterpiece, capable of 472 miles per hour at extreme altitudes. It was the fastest propeller plane the Germans ever flew. But even as it took to the skies, it was already a relic. The German scientists had pivoted to a design that looked like it belonged in the year 2000, the Me 2062. Unlike the British Meteor, which used a centrifugal flow engine, the Germans were perfecting axial flow, a slimmer, more efficient way to compress air. They were also experimenting with swept wings. While the rest of the world was still flying straight-edged wings, the Germans realized that angling the wings back allowed the air to slip past at much higher speeds before compressibility could take hold. This was the birth of the modern silhouette we see in every fighter jet today. This middle act of the war was a period of turbo-boosted dreams and high-stakes gambling. Engineers were pushing piston engines so hard they would often explode during test flights, all while secret jet programs were burning through national budgets.
The pilots were the guinea pigs, flying at speeds that their instruments weren't even designed to measure. They were the pioneers of a new frontier, standing on the edge of the jet age, waiting for the one machine that would finally crown itself the undisputed king of the skies. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change aviation history forever.
In the summer of 1944, the king of speed finally descended from the clouds, and it didn't look like anything the Allied pilots had been trained to fight. When the Messerschmitt Me-262 Schwalbe entered the fray, it didn't just break the records, it broke the morale of every bomber crew in the sky. Imagine being a tail gunner in a B-17, scanning the horizon for the familiar silhouette of a Bf-109. Suddenly, a shape appears. It has no propeller. It leaves a trail of black soot and a haunting, jet-whined scream. Before you can even swing your turret, the Schwalbe has covered a mile and unleashed a barrage of 30mm cannon shells. At 540 miles per hour, the Me-262 was nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the best Allied piston fighters. It was like a Ferrari racing against horse-drawn carriages. The secret to this terrifying velocity lay in two revolutionary Junkers Umo 004 engines. Unlike the Allied jets of the time, the Me-262 utilized axial flow compressors, where the air moved in a straight line through the engine, allowing for a much slimmer, more aerodynamic, shark-like nacelle. Coupled with its 35-degree swept wings, the Me-262 was the first aircraft to successfully navigate the transonic region. While the Spitfires and Mustangs were vibrating to pieces as they approached the speed of sound, the 262's wings allowed the shock waves to slide off the back, maintaining stability at speeds that were previously considered suicidal. But being the king came with a heavy, often lethal price. The Me-262 was a glass cannon. Its engines were masterpieces of theory, but failures of metallurgy. Because Germany was running out of high-grade nickel and chromium, the jet turbines would literally melt or explode after only 10 to 20 hours of flight. If a pilot slammed the throttle forward too quickly, the engine would flame out or catch fire mid-air. The king of speed was most vulnerable when it was trying to take off or land. It was so fast that its landing gear was fragile, and its slow acceleration at low speeds made it an easy target for leapfrog tactics used by P-51 Mustang pilots who waited near German airfields to pounce on the jets while they were heavy and slow. The impact of this machine, however, was far greater than its kill count. The Allies realized that the age of the propeller was over. In the final weeks of the war, Operation Lusty was launched, a desperate race by American and British intelligence to capture Me-262s, their blueprints, and their scientists. These captured kings were shipped back to the United States and the Soviet Union. When you look at the North American F-86 Sabre or the MiG-15 that fought in the skies over Korea just 5 years later, you are looking at the direct DNA of the Me-262. The swept wings, the nose-mounted cannons, and the axial flow engines were all lessons learned from the Schwalbe. WW2's race for speed ended not with a gradual improvement, but with a violent technological explosion. The Me-262 proved that in modern warfare, being fast enough wasn't an option. You either owned the speed of the future, or you were a target from the past. It was the undisputed king of speed, a machine that was too late to save the Third Reich, but just in time to define every fighter jet for the next century.
From the first 100-mile-per-hour biplanes of 1914 to the 500-mile-per-hour jet of 1944, humanity had conquered the sky in a single generation. The era of the piston was dead. The era of the jet had been born in a streak of silver and a smell of kerosene.